My sister stood in court holding my husband's hand, like she'd earned the right to stand beside him. The room fell quiet just before she said it. Pay up or step aside. Her voice didn't shake, but mine didn't either. My parents shifted closer to their side of the aisle, already choosing their version of the truth. Already choosing who they thought was worthy of protection. My sister stood in court holding my husband's hand and said, "Pay up, or step aside," I thought. My parents backed them, demanding I support the baby they had behind my back. I just smiled until I started reading my notes. They went pale, and then screamed. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to break. Waiting for me to accept the humiliation they decided I deserved. Instead, I looked at all of them, and I smiled. They had no idea what was coming next. The air in the courtroom was stale, and smelled faintly of old paper and dust. The kind of place designed to drain the color from your skin and the fight from your bones. My navy suit felt like armor, heavy and necessary. Haley's dress, a soft, pale blue, was chosen to communicate frailty, an assumption that was woven into the fabric of our family history. People like to assume I was always the quiet one, the steady son, the reliable brother, the man who never raised his voice, unless absolutely necessary. And maybe that used to be true. I built my life on predictability, on routines that made sense. Morning coffee at the same corner shop at 6:37. Reports reviewed before sunrise. My evenings spent unwinding with a book instead of a screen. In operations management, order isn't just helpful. It's survival. And order was something I understood deeply, mathematically. But families have a way of rewriting who you are, even when you're standing right there listening. I watched Marcus squeeze Haley's hand, a gesture of public solidarity that was meant to be a knife in my gut. He looked the part of the devoted partner, his brow furrowed with concern, his eyes lowered just enough to appear humble. He was always drawn to the calm I carried like a second skin. He once told me, "You make everything feel grounded." For a long time, I believed that meant something sacred, something about my inherent value. Maybe it did, until the day my steadiness became something he used against me. Evidence that I didn't feel enough, that I was distant, that Haley was simply more expressive. Funny how words can be softened into excuses when someone needs them to be. The legal proceeding felt surreal, muffled. Haley's attorney spoke first, her voice like polished marble, smooth, hard, unwavering. "Your Honor, this case is simple," she recited, leaning into the petitioner's table. "The child was born into a complex family situation. Mr. Eli is the only one with stable income and long-term financial consistency. He has been part of the support system, and we request formal contribution to ensure the baby's well-being." I tightened my fingers slightly around the folder tucked beneath my arm. My breath didn't stutter, but my heart, that steady, methodical machine, ticked faster. Haley didn't look at the judge when the lawyer spoke. She looked at me, as if expecting me to crumble on cue. She expected the quiet brother, the accommodating one, the man who cleaned up broken glass while she got comforted. She expected the narrative to continue. And I was about to show her. I'd finally stopped taking notes. I was about to show her I was ready to start reading them. The quiet refusal to shatter in that courtroom. That smile that promised a counter move was built on a lifetime of maintaining my internal equilibrium. I couldn't break because I had spent 35 years learning how not to. It was the only way I knew how to survive in the ecosystem of my family. In my professional life, that discipline was gold. Operations management is the art of predicting failure and designing systems that prevent it. Order isn't a preference. It's a prerequisite. I worked a demanding schedule, often arriving at the office before 6 in the morning, reviewing complex logistics reports while the city was still asleep. I had a reputation for being reliable, steady, and utterly impervious to panic. That is what Marcus had initially loved, or so he claimed. You make everything feel grounded, he had said once, years ago, leaning across our kitchen counter while I paid bills. It was a compliment, yet now I saw it as a cage. My steadiness was not sacred, it was merely useful. Growing up, Haley was the emotional earthquake. If she dropped a glass, she cried. If she got caught lying, she cried harder. Her face scrunching up in a performance that would have won her an Oscar if life were fair. Mom would gather her into her arms like she was made of sponge sugar, a delicate creature who couldn't bear the harsh realities of life. Dad would sigh, turning his gaze on me, always asking the same question. Can't you be a little gentler with your sister, Ely? I'd be the one sweeping the glass, fixing the mess, stepping aside so she could shine, or at least, so she could have center stage. That became our pattern, established early and reinforced constantly. I cleaned up quietly. She sparkled or shattered loudly, depending on the desired effect. I didn't just observe this pattern, I internalized it. I learned that my quiet competence had no emotional current family, showing distress in my family. Distress meant weakness and guaranteed neglect. So I built my life on prediction and control, becoming the architect of order. This created the Eli that Marcus was drawn to, the calm, methodical man who appeared utterly dependable. I thought dependability meant love, that my value was inherent in my reliable stability. I remember talking about this with Sarah Cooper, my childhood friend and now a kind of reluctant emotional confidant, months before the affair fully erupted into my life. We were having coffee one evening, and she watched me organize my sugar packets before adding one to my cup. You categorize your entire life, Ely, she said gently, swirling her own drink. Sarah, a therapist, had a way of seeing the foundation beneath the facade. It is effective, I replied, perhaps too quickly. It minimizes surprises. She nodded. And what does it do? The things you can't categorize. Like how you feel about something? I paused, realizing the question was less about my coffee routine and more about my marriage, which was already showing cracks. I manage them, I said simply. You suppress them, she corrected, but without judgment. You make yourself so steady that the people around you feel comfortable making messes. They rely on your lack of reaction. I bristled then, feeling the sting of her accurate observation. Now, facing the cold reality of the courtroom, I understood she was right. My emotional avoidance, my need for rigid internal order, had become the most effective tool my sister and my former husband had to use against me. They knew I wouldn't scream, wouldn't fight ugly, and wouldn't break down. They counted on the fact that I would try to manage the feeling, rather than confront the source. My misunderstanding, my belief that my order equaled security, was the original sin they were exploiting. That was the foundation they built their betrayal on. The man who made everything feel grounded was about to. The ground pulled out from under him, precisely because he wouldn't raise his voice. But what they failed to understand was that the order I built was structural. And a good architect knows how to tear a faulty building down without getting hurt in the process. My analysis of the past had confirmed the hypothesis, my lifeline, the habit of clean up and control had been weaponized. Now I had to relive the slow, agonizing realization that the weapon was pointed directly at my heart. The shift was subtle at first, insidious, like damp seeping into a solid foundation. It started with whispers. Conversations between Marcus and Haley in the kitchen, when they thought I was asleep. I heard only fragments. Shared laughter that lingered a little too long. Words that stopped abruptly when my footsteps neared. Haley began showing up at our place, unannounced. Just to talk, but she stayed past midnight, claiming she needed Marcus's calm energy, because she was having a bad week. Every time, Marcus defended her presence at every turn, suggesting I was being difficult for wanting my own home to be a quiet space. After a 10-hour workday, I started finding clues that I convinced myself meant nothing. Her overpowering jasmine perfume in our guest bathroom, lingering long after she was gone. I'd open the laundry and see a shirt I didn't recognize. A soft, faded cotton tee that was decidedly not mine. When I asked Marcus about it, he just shrugged, as if it wasn't worth the emotional energy to discuss, which usually meant I would drop the subject to keep the peace. He specialized in that kind of emotional dismissal. Then came the family dinners, the ones where the script really started to change. My mother watched Haley with a warmth she had never once aimed at me, a soft, indulgent look reserved for the perpetually fragile. My father, who had always praised my work ethic, would ask Marcus if he was managing okay with all the stress Idlites puts on himself. I sat there, my fork paused mid-air over a perfectly arranged plate of asparagus, and felt a cold, sharp shock. It was the moment I realized the story was shifting, and I hadn't been invited into the author's room. My role as the steady anchor was being rewritten into the source of the strain. I remember one dinner vividly. Haley was holding court, weeping softly about a minor professional setback. Marcus stood behind her, a hand on her shoulder, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world, a martyr of my quiet coldness. My mother murmured about how sensitive Haley was, and my father nodded gravely. I sat there, looking at the two of them, and then at my parents, seeing the whole tableau. It was a performance they had perfected since childhood. Haley creates the drama, everyone rushes in to comfort her, and I, the one who requires no emotional labor, am left to observe. The ultimate betrayal arrived later that month. When Haley announced her pregnancy, she cried, of course she cried. And Mom hugged her so quickly it almost looked rehearsed, like a well-blocked scene. Marcus stood behind her with a hand on her shoulder, looking proud and relieved. no one looked at me. Not even once. In that strange, suspended moment, I didn't feel rage or shock. I felt the chilling, analytical clarity of a man waking up from a long, confusing dream. I understood the betrayal didn't start with the affair, or the whispered jokes, or the shirt in the laundry basket. It started long before, with every moment my family chose convenience over truth, choosing Haley's manufactured chaos over my stable reality. They didn't want the truth, they wanted the easiest path. And that path required me to be the reliable, stoic one who would eventually just absorb the shock. I wasn't angry yet. I was simply waking up to the fact that they hadn't just hurt me. They had calculated it, and my quiet nature had made the calculation easy. The weeks to the pregnancy announcement felt exactly like I describe. A house where every picture frame had been tilted, the order purposefully disrupted. I was no longer observing the affair. I was witnessing the calculated construction of a legal case against me, a process I realized I was implicitly funding through my own stability. My mother called me more often, but never to check on me, the spouse whose marriage was dissolving. She called to report how fragile Haley was feeling. Dad suggested I lighten up on the work stress, as if the tension knotting my shoulders had anything to do with spreadsheets and not the deliberate sabotage of my home life. And Marcus, he played his role with almost elegant restraint. He never directly said I was unstable. He simply implied it in the soft, careful tone people use when they're building a case. She has been overwhelmed lately, he told my parents over dinner one Tuesday. Knowing I was within earshot, my operation schedule spread out on my lap. It has been a tough season, he added with a sigh. Like the weight of my existence rested entirely on his broad, compassionate shoulders. Haley nodded beside him, her eyes lowered just enough to look concerned, but not quite enough to hide the small, private flicker of satisfaction. She had perfected that performance years ago. The goal wasn't to get me to cry or fight. It was to get the family to accept a new narrative before even understand the old one had been canceled. Then the story started shifting, and it became actively aggressive. She cried at work today. Haley told Mom over the phone one afternoon, unaware I had my office line forwarded to my cell. She snapped at a barista. She forgot an appointment. None of it was true. I had spent that entire day at a high-level logistics meeting in Seattle, presenting a $3.4 million budget proposal. But truth didn't matter. Not when my family already had a narrative they preferred. The one where Haley was soft and helpless, and I was rigid enough to be the sole cause of friction. One night, Mom called with a voice full of manufactured urgency. "We are worried about you, sweetheart. Marcus is doing his best, but you need support. He is carrying so much." It was the first time I realized, officially switched my role in the family script. I wasn't the steady one anymore. I was the problem to be handled. My reliability had been weaponized. It proved I was cold. My silence was proof of distance. My job success was evidence of my detachment. Every core trait I possessed was being used as ammunition against me. The real turning point came in a plain, white envelope slipped under my apartment door. I found it when I got home from a late audit. The paper pristine, the text inside shattering. It was a notice to appear in court. A child support hearing. I read it twice, then a third time, convinced I'd misunderstood, but the wording was clear. Haley and Marcus were petitioning for financial support, claiming I was the most stable member of the family, and therefore best positioned to contribute to the child's well-being. The child they conceived behind my back. They were asking me to fund the very betrayal they had engineered. I brought the letter immediately to my parents' house. Despite everything, the whispers, the glances, the rewriting of history, I held on to the foolish hope that I would hear disbelief, outrage, a hint of loyalty. Instead, they stood together in the living room, their expressions resolute, their arms folded. A lie, Dad said, his voice flat with conviction. You are financially secure. You can help. Mom folded her arms tighter. It is not the baby's fault. Don't punish an innocent child. Haley is struggling enough. When I finally managed to ask if they understood what they were supporting, what Haley and Marcus had done, Haley stepped forward. She rested one hand protectively over her stomach, the other reaching back for Marcus. We are building a family, Ali, she whispered, her voice dangerously soft. You can either help or step aside. There it was. The first version of the line she would later repeat in court. A threat disguised as reason, a command wrapped in honey. And, in that moment, something inside me finally sharpened. The anger wasn't hitting me like a chaotic wave, demanding a scream or a collapse. It was rising steady and controlled, like water finding its level. A deep, cold resolve. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly, feeling everything inside me rearrange itself into a new, defensive order. The story they were writing was almost complete. They had no idea I was about to take the pen back. The night after my parents chose their side and Haley gave her cold ultimatum, I went home to an apartment that suddenly felt borrowed. Even though I had paid for every inch of it, nothing had changed physically. Same eucalyptus candle on the counter. Same stack of expense reports waiting on my desk. But the air felt thinner, sterile, like the walls were listening, waiting for me to react in the predictable, accommodating way. I set my keys down and finally let myself sit on the floor, knees pulled tight to my chest. The silence pressed against me, cold and steady. It wasn't the kind of chaos Haley would have generated. It wasn't grief, not yet. It was the crushing weight of understanding. They weren't confused. They weren't misled. They had simply chosen the easier story, the one where Haley was soft and helpless, and I was rigid enough to carry everyone else's mistakes. They had exploited one thing I valued most, my order. I stayed there a long time, staring at the pattern of street lamp light crawling across the hardwood floor. I was waiting for the emotional collapse that never came. The breakdown was quiet, contained, exactly the way my family always expected strength to look on me. But something shifted beneath it. Something sharp and hard. When I finally stood, it wasn't to cry or to call Sarah for comfort. It was to work. I pulled out my planner, my phone, and my laptop. I started sifting through everything. Text schedules, VIP logs, photos, credit card statements. I combed through months of communication, not looking for pain, but for patterns. I was looking for the flaws in their logistics. And the patterns were there, blunt, sloppy, arrogant. Messages from Marcus to Haley at hours. He claimed he'd been training at the gym, complete with location data, showing him 3 miles from our apartment. Haley telling Mom she'd brought me dinner on the night I was actually out of town for a work conference. My parents praising Marcus for supporting the family, while Haley, in a separate group thread I had access to from a shared cloud service, bragged to a friend about how she was finally getting the life she deserved. The narrative wasn't just flawed. It was meticulously engineered. Around midnight, there was a soft, tentative knock at the door. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Turner, stood there in her thick slippers holding a small glass dish. "I made too much soup," she murmured, the same line she had used for the 10 years she lived next door. We talked briefly about the weather and the difficulty of finding good parking. Nothing heavy, until she hesitated, lowering her voice. "I saw Marcus at your sister's place a lot this past spring, dear," she murmured, a worried look in her eye. Before all this mess, I thought you knew. He was there many afternoons, around 4 o'clock. Her words weren't sharp, but they pierced anyway. Not because they delivered new information, but because they confirmed that the outside world had seen the truth long before my own family had chosen to admit it. I thanked her, took the soup, and closed the door gently. I sat back down with my notes. By 2 in the morning, the beginnings of a blueprint spread across my kitchen table. It was a clear timeline, a set of contradictions, a string of messages and behaviors that alone meant little, but together painted the clearest picture I'd ever seen. Haley and Marcus weren't just selfish, they were strategic. And for the first time, I realized I could be strategic too, but with superior data. When dawn broke, I packed everything into a neat folder. Dates, screenshots, observations, statements. Each page a piece of a story they never expected me to tell. Later in court, they would see that folder and mistake it for hesitation. But in the moment when I closed it, when my fingers brushed the edge of the paper and a deep, cold calm settled into my bones, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. I looked at the folder and exhaled slowly. I just smiled because now, the true story belonged to me. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. It was the kind of place meant to intimidate, reminding you how many lives had been rearranged within its walls. I walked in, my one folder tucked securely beneath my arm. It contained the months of analytical work I had undertaken, the evidence that had replaced my pain with purpose. My expensive leather heels echoed down the hallway, like a metronome, marking the final countdown. Haley and Marcus were already inside, seated together at the petitioner's table. She was holding his hand, her thumb brushing over his knuckles in small, triumphant strokes. I watched them from the doorway for a beat, noting the physical closeness they displayed. A subtle performance for the benefit of the court, a manufactured image of unity. When Haley finally looked up and saw me, her smile tightened. It wasn't nervous, and it wasn't guilty. It was pure smugness. The way someone smiles when they think The finish line is already behind them. She expected the quiet, wounded man who would settle, just to make the conflict disappear. My parents sat behind them, leaning forward as if to physically hold up their narrative. Mom gave me a curt, dismissive nod. Dad didn't look at me at all, his gaze fixed resolutely on the table. The judge entered, a serious woman with silver hair pulled back severely, and the room snapped into a hush. We rose. We sat. The hearing began. Haley's attorney spoke first, running through the highlights of my financial situation, my high salary, my assets, my clear lack of dependence, painting me as a bottomless resource that should logically be tapped. Your Honor, this case is simple, she repeated from her opening. The child was born into a complex family situation. Mr. Eli is the only one with stable income and long-term financial consistency. She has been part of the support system, and we request formal contribution to ensure the baby's well-being. My breath didn't stutter, but my fingers tightened slightly on the folder, gripping the edge of the paper. Haley watched me, expecting the crumble, the fold, the apology for things I never did. She expected the girl, who cleaned up broken glass while she got comforted. Marcus cleared his throat dramatically, adding his manufactured piece. Eli knows we're just trying to do what's best. He knows. He has always been the responsible one. Responsible. Not betrayed, not wronged, just responsible. The word was used as a chain. It was almost funny how they reduced my entire life to a single, exploitable adjective. Then Haley stood. She laced her fingers with Marcus's and faced the judge with a trembling lower lip that looked expertly practiced. We're not asking for much, Your Honor. Just help. My brother understands family responsibility. Or, at least, he used to. Behind her, Mom murmured in approving, "That's right." The judge turned to me, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Eli, do you have a response?" This was the moment. The exact millisecond where Haley and Marcus expected the quiet man to agree, or maybe, if I was feeling dramatic, to raise his voice in a frustrated, inarticulate outburst that would only confirm their narrative of my instability. Instead, I reached for my folder, stood up slowly, and looked directly at Haley. I didn't open the folder yet. I just smiled. It wasn't a gentle smile, but a cold, hard line that faltered her expression, almost imperceptibly. Then, I flipped open the folder. Not with a dramatic flourish, but with the controlled, measured movement of a man beginning a very difficult, but very necessary, audit. Your Honor, I began, my voice clear and level, exactly as it sounds when I address a board meeting. I do have a response, and I'd like to start by clearing up a few details regarding a petitioner's claimed need and my alleged distance. I laid the first page neatly on the table. The audit had begun. I laid the first page on the table, a printed text thread complete with dates, times, and locations, the stark typography of betrayal. "This," I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom silence, "is Marcus messaging Haley during hours he claimed to be at work, training. Dozens of times over several months. The time-stamped locations place him repeatedly at her apartment, which is approximately 3 miles from our home." The judge adjusted her glasses, leaning forward slightly. Haley's face drained of color, her eyes flicking rapidly between the page and Marcus. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. I continued, my gaze fixed on the judge, maintaining the detached focus of an auditor revealing catastrophic inefficiency. These, I added, placing the next sheet down, are screenshots of Haley telling my mother and father that I broke down crying at work on a day I was traveling for a conference in Seattle. Here, I pointed to the time-stamped itinerary. Is a confirmed itinerary and signed hotel check. In from that same afternoon. My parents looked at each other, their expressions twisting into confusion, doubt, a flicker of something that wasn't certainty anymore. Something I hadn't seen directed at Haley in decades. Haley whispered, her voice high and panicked. That is taken out of context. I didn't look at her. I wasn't finished. This, I said, sliding another page forward, is a notarized statement from Mrs. Turner, my neighbor, confirming. She saw Marcus visiting Haley regularly, often around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, long before my marriage ended. I then laid down another sheet, a screenshot that carried the weight of pure, calculated cruelty. And here is Marcus, texting Haley after one of those visits, saying, "It is better if Eli thinks we are helping him." A sharp gasp came from somewhere behind us, likely one of my parents. Marcus jerked upright, his face starting to turn a dangerous red. "That's private," he ground out. The judge held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Set." I opened my notes again. "Everyone here," I said quietly, addressing the judge but including everyone in the small room. Assumed their story was the only story. They relied on my reputation for silence in order to sell a manufactured truth. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I methodically read off dates, comparing the fictional account against the irrefutable evidence. I detailed when Haley told Mom I was unstable compared to footage of me giving a department presentation that same afternoon. Calm, composed, nothing like the character they'd painted. I read out entries documenting every time Marcus told my parents I'd been snapping or withdrawing, paired with the subsequent messages where he assured Haley, "It is working. They think he is losing it." Haley's eyes brimmed, but not with sorrow. This was panic, raw and unfiltered. Marcus's face was now a dark, florid red. "Eli, stop," Marcus pleaded, his control finally fractured. "This isn't right." "This is exactly what it is," I replied. I brought out the final page. It was simple, not dramatic or explosive. A clean, color-coded timeline chart, neat, unmistakable. "This," I said, placing it gently before the judge, "is the communication audit, summarizing the months of manipulation leading up to today's hearing. It shows intentional misrepresentation, coordinated storytelling, and attempts to weaponize family pressure to financial gain." Silence settled over the room like dust. Then, slowly, the judge leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Your petition for support," she said, turning her attention to Haley and Marcus, "is denied." She paused, letting the full weight of the decision sink in. "Additionally, this court is troubled by the pattern of deception presented here today. You may face further review for misuse of legal procedure." Mom gasped, covering her mouth. Dad muttered something inaudible under his breath. Haley clutched Marcus's arm. Marcus stared rigidly at the floor. Both of them looked small, and then it happened. The collapse, the unraveling, the panic that had been building behind their ribs broke open, ugly and loud. They went pale, then they screamed. Not horror, movie screams, not dramatic wails, just the desperate, choking sound of people who finally understood that the truth they'd buried had claws. And today, it had dug back out. I closed my folder, calmly. The way you might close a chapter in a book you'd read too many times. The bailiff was still shouting for order, but there was no returning to order. Not for Haley and Marcus. Not anymore. I turned, smoothed my blazer, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I didn't need to see the wreckage. I already knew the story had finally, irrevocably shifted. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Cooler, clearer. Like the city itself exhaled with me. I didn't rush. I didn't check whether anyone followed. The world was finally quiet. The noise of their manufactured drama muted. Behind me, I could still hear fragments of raised voices filtering through the heavy doors. My parents demanding answers, Haley sobbing, Marcus insisting. It wasn't supposed to go this way. But none of it belonged to me anymore. I walked down the marble steps slowly, feeling each moment settle into place. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't revenge. It was release. For the first time in years, my body felt like it belonged entirely to me. My breath, my choices, my future. I pulled out my phone as I reached the sidewalk. There was one new message. It was from Mom. We didn't know. The text read. 2 words that summarized their lifetime of willful ignorance. I deleted the message without replying. Some truths don't need an audience, and some betrayals don't get rewound. Their failure to know was their responsibility, not mine to forgive. I walked 3 blocks before my phone rang again. It was Sarah Cooper. I just heard, she said, her voice low and impressed. That was surgical, Eli. You didn't break. You just strategized. It's what I do best, I replied, the small acknowledgement feeling like a deep breath. You proved the data, Sarah said. But how are you? You still sound like a spreadsheet. I stopped at a crosswalk, watching the traffic flow. I feel quiet, Sarah. I feel a lot less heavy. For so long, I thought my job was to contain the chaos for them. When they demanded money, they demanded I pay for their freedom while they chained me to their mess. Now, the mess is theirs, and the order is mine. That is a big shift, Eli, she murmured. You used your control to set yourself free. You didn't suppress the anger, you channeled it. She was right. I hadn't succumbed to the scream they expected. I had used my analytical mind, the very thing they discounted as coldness, to expose their corruption. My steadiness hadn't been a weakness. It was the superior platform from which to launch my defense. I realized the profound difference between being emotionally closed off and being strategically reserved. My arc wasn't about becoming suddenly expressive, but about learning when to deploy my voice for my own benefit, rather than keeping silent for theirs. We talked for 10 minutes about the path ahead, the divorce, the need for new boundaries, the inevitable fallout with my parents, which I already accepted. Sarah reminded me that while the legal battle was won, the emotional process of grief still needed attention. I agreed, knowing that now, at least, I could approach that process as a free agent, not as the victim in a story written by others. At the corner, I waited for the light to turn, watching leaves drift across the pavement. I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking back to myself. I had spent my entire life trying to maintain an order that benefited everyone else. Now, I would use that order to build a structure solely for me. In the end, it wasn't about proving them wrong in the eyes of the law. It was about finally choosing myself after years of being written out of my own story. The betrayal had forced me to confront the core of my existence, my need for control. By using that control not to hide, but to expose the truth, I had secured the greatest freedom of all. I had found my voice, and it was devastatingly calm. The chapter was closed. I was ready for the next phase.